Hello, everyone. Today I'm delighted to bring you a special crossover episode of the podcast. We are flipping the mic, and this is a conversation with the Mindful Medic podcast favourite Frentor, Dr Andrea Austin. Regular listeners will know that Andrea and I try to record an episode together at least annually, and this one is a bit belated, and you will find out why in the body of this conversation and episode. Uh, for those who don't already know her, Andrea is an emergency physician based in the US in San Diego. She is an educator, a simulationist, and a fellow podcaster. She is the host of the Heartline podcast, which is all about change making in healthcare. And so this episode was recorded on Heartline, and I had the fascinating opportunity to flip the mic on Andrea and dive into her recently published master's thesis work on healthcare change makers. This is really interesting qualitative research and draws on many themes that we have both explored in our podcasts over the years. And it's a subject that we are both very invested in. I don't want to spoil this episode, so I'll let you listen and we'll get into it. But you can head over to the Heartline podcast, which I will link in the show notes, to learn more about Andrea and her work and listen to episodes with many more healthcare change makers. Enjoy.
Welcome to Heartline, conversations with healthcare changemakers following their Heartline. I'm your host, Dr. Andrea Austin. I'm an emergency medicine physician, coach, and educator. I believe that healthcare needs to improve the quality care that patients receive, and that supporting the workers is at the heart of this transformation. Well, I am really excited today that I get to turn the mic on Dr. Andrea Austin. This is our second attempt, in full disclosure, at this episode. We had really planned to do it for Andrea's milestone of 100 episodes of the Heartline podcast, which, congratulations, that's no mean feat. We wanted to talk a bit more about Andrea's fascinating research. I'm really excited to dive into this today on changemaking in healthcare, which I think is a topic that we have visited many times through our podcasts. And it starts to really draw together some of the themes that have emerged in our own work in a more concrete way, certainly from my perspective when I've read. Now, the other side to this story, and we'll get into, that this work is hard and it's hard to maintain momentum and motivation. I think it was Andrea herself that said, healthcare is a bin fire right now. And Andrea had done a really tough run of shifts when we first attempted to do this recording. And what we now realize in retrospect that we should have just taken the time to have a good debrief and some shared peer support, which is one of she is one of my stabilizing relationships. And that's one of the themes that certainly emerged in her research. So I'm excited today to have another attempt at this and really look at what are the areas when this work is hard that we can use as individuals and collectively to enact the positive change that we want to see in healthcare. Hello, Andrea. Hello.
Thanks for having me. It's kind of strange doing an introduction when it's not really my podcast. It's kind of a crossover, but I am really, I'm excited. And yeah, it's just like coming home, having a conversation with Dr. Andrea Austin. And we're going to talk a bit about change today and how we enable change.
Yep. I'm here for it.
I like this idea of hope as something that we co-create through really intentional and smart strategy. So using the science of change and the practice. And I think a couple of my recent episodes have really drilled down further on how we do this in healthcare. So that I've gone on a bit of a tangent already, but the reason we didn't have, or we kind of binned our first podcast episode was you'd had a really rough couple of shifts.
And, you know, I think I've quoted you a few times. So when you're healthcare can be a bin fire right now, and it can be really tough. And I think when you're in the thick of it, it's easy to become lost in that. And we'll talk a bit about that. But I think that's really important to acknowledge. And you and I said together, we probably should have had a good debrief and a peer support session. And I know that's something that's become critically important to me over time. But we also want to create strategic hope. You know, what is working well? What can we learn from excellence? And again, those kind of pockets of bright light are things that we really look for in our podcasts. You know, how can we act within our sphere of control and influence? And so that is something that I want to bring in today. And I think it's very relevant because you have done some really interesting research through your master's, and I had the privilege of reading your thesis recently, and there's so many themes that I want to discuss today. So with that rather lengthy preamble, tell me a bit about how your research, you know, why you chose the theme of change and change making a couple of years ago, and then we'll take an opportunity to dive deeper into the research.
Yeah, so it's interesting going through the thesis process. And my initial draft was actually on a study about the phenomenon of learned helplessness in physicians. And as I pulled the literature for that and began writing it up, the practicality of like, how are you going to study, like, hi, I identify as somebody with learned helplessness. Like it's a very difficult study to recruit for. So I kind of, you know, when you're looking at the negative, and it's funny about the episode that didn't work out between us, you look at the negative and it's like, okay, what happened there? And then what's the positive? What's the different way to look at this? So if physicians are experiencing learned helplessness, the opposite of that is feeling agency. And so the end product of my research is not to create more people with learned helplessness, is to have more people that are with the positive, the agency and the change making. So that's where the initial idea came from. And then, I'm fortunate that I have a great thesis committee and, 2 PhDs on the committee that are really steeped in the theoretical framing. And I'm sure we'll get into that. But it was really about trying to solve this problem of the lack of engagement, involvement, hope that we have in healthcare right now.
Great. And, I think kind of building on what we started by saying, we don't want to be Pollyanna about this and pretend that there's not real problems. But it can be very difficult, particularly as an individual in the moment. And you really have to go internally and protect yourself. You can only start where you are and within your own sphere and locus of control and influence. But I think some of the work that you have done in building on some of my recent episodes with Dr. Pedja Sturgisic and Dr. Don Berwick about organising and method in mobilisation. I think it was Don who said, you don't do this work alone. And so that is what I find fascinating about your research, because it pulls a lot of these themes out in terms of how you actually go about this. If you're starting as an individual thinking, I want to make a difference, I want to enact and find my agency. So I might strip it back because you've given us a bit of a insight as to why this is important. And I think anyone who knows you knows that this is, a core area of interest, and it's, your passion and mission. What do we mean by a change maker? Yeah. And you might talk about change agents because you talk about this in your book as well.
Yeah. So I chose the term change maker very deliberately, and it's a term that was developed in kind of, a random website link, PDF. It's not published in a peer-reviewed paper, But the author described a change maker as somebody who makes a change that's for societal good. And where I feel very strongly about where healthcare needs to go is coming back to that framework of, at the end of the day, why does healthcare exist? It exists to take care of people. And I think part of the reason a lot of people, are suffering from burnout and dissatisfaction in the workplace is they don't feel like healthcare is doing its sole purpose, its actual role to take care of people, or at least it's not doing it in the way, we think is best. Change agent, there's tons of change agents running around healthcare right now. There's people that are making changes that don't necessarily align with societal good, that don't align with the triple aim or the quadruple aim. So to get at the inclusion criteria for our study is needed to be a change that was in line with the quadruple aim, which, any listeners of your pod will know that has to be something that was good for individual patients and patient outcomes, that is cost conscious. And the quadruple aim adds that it's good for the healthcare professionals working as well. So that was the framework we used for finding the change makers that we studied.
I think that's important because aggressive change for change's sake is really unsettling. And I've used the word aggressive there, but I think I was once told that not to use the word change because it is very aggressive. And, intentional change with purpose to do good and to align with the mission, that is different. I think, terms like progress and evolution are maybe a bit more gentle, but there's definitely a learning anxiety. And I have felt that when new change projects have come into my world and professionally, and I have resisted it very strongly. So we might visit that as we go through and the kind of challenges. So you've decided that you're going to focus on this as part of your research, and this was a qualitative research project. You have some great and mentors and supervisors on your team, and I've had a recent conversation with Dr. Josh Hartzell, and some of his work in the book will come up, no doubt, in our conversation. So how did you identify your study participants?
Yeah, so we used that they had to have done a change that was in line with the quadruple aim, and they had to actually enact it. It couldn't be, a good idea. It had to be something that happened. And it was word of mouth, as a lot of these studies are. So we used primarily my network and Dr. Josh Hartzell's. We did choose physicians, and we also chose physicians in the United States. And I went with that because I wanted to make sure I understood the context of the change. And I just didn't feel like I understood, at least when we were writing this proposal. If I had to go back and do it again, I don't know if that would have been such an important part of it. Certainly there's lots of room for more studies. But I did want to do physicians particularly because I do feel like they face some really unique challenges with being change makers. I think one of the things we haven't talked a ton about is, to be a physician and to know that medical knowledge is doubling approximately every 3 months. And there's a lot of tension to stay clinically relevant and, certainly fear that if I'm not keeping up on my clinical skills, I may make a mistake. I could hurt somebody. I could get sued. So, I think there's a lot of physicians that may want to be more involved in change making, but feel that tension of, well, I have to work X number of shifts. I have to do this much. Else I'll lose my clinical skills. So I really wanted to understand physicians that were successful in change making, and that were able to ride that wave of being a physician in particular.
What do we know about this so far? What literature exists already on this topic, and anything in healthcare specifically?
Yeah. So really interesting. When you look at change agents or change management in the healthcare context, most of what will come up is things related to quality improvement and more describing like how to specifically enact a change. You'll find papers that will tell you about Cotter's change framework, which, I see you shaking your head. You can't graduate with an MBA without learning about Cotter's. So you'll see papers that, describe using Cotters and applying it in a healthcare context. But really, there's no rich description of any study population like ours that were in this study. There is some description of change makers, or they think they use the term change agents in the medical education space that were able to successfully enact curricular change. There's a lot of opinion pieces like, hey, healthcare is really broken. We need to make change and we need to teach residents and fellows how to do that. But this is really an underdeveloped area. And I know we'll get to it, but I think probably one of the most important things that came out of this paper is not only the description of the individual factors, but, the call to action of this paper was the organizational actions that can be put into place that foster more change makers. And, that's honestly what I'm most proud of, and that I can't wait for that to really get disseminated into the world.
I've highlighted this crucial interplay between individual agency, which we'll talk about, and the organizational support for change making. And so let's go back then. You start to do, and is it semi-structured interviews was the format?
Yep. So semi-structured, we had like an interview guide, but then the fun part about qualitative research is you can use your intuition. And, it's funny, I never really set out to be a qualitative researcher, but I also had a podcast, and I didn't realize I was building a qualitative research study, essentially training ground through interviewing. So, there definitely was the script, but then somebody says something and, if you think of a question or, you want to follow it down, you had the flexibility to do that because inevitably people bring up things that you weren't expecting. So that's the nice part of having something semi-structured.
So on that, when you were actually devising your first questions, what did you draw on? Did you draw on some of your past experiences through interviewing many, many physicians through the podcast? Was there any existing frameworks that you were able to draw on to?
Yeah. So the cool part, it doesn't seem cool when you're doing it. When you go through a master's program, and mine, to really was focused, it's on publication and research, is understanding a theoretical framework. And so the theoretical framework that we used for our paper gets at this idea that no change happens without a personal transformation. And that's Chris Argyris's work, that transformative learning on the individual level fuels transformational change on the organizational level. So we used that as the theoretical grounding to then start to develop questions. Essentially, when I looked at Cotters, doctors are smart. If enacting change in healthcare was as easy as following Cotters, then we would all be doing it and we'd all be working in great systems. So clearly, it's not just about following the steps in Cotters. And so when I developed the questions, I really wanted to understand the connective tissue between the steps in Cotters. Like, I'm supposed to create a coalition. Okay. Well, how do you create a coalition of people around you? Like, actually, what were the steps? And what were the things that you did that were kind of individual? Like, I'm going to read Brene Brown's book. And what were the things that the organization did that accelerated your growth? Because to be frank, like, we can't go at the pace of improving things that we're at right now, where any system is out of money and our health outcomes are too abysmal to go at this pace. So from my standpoint, the only way we're going to get out from underneath of this mess is that we rapidly accelerate the number of change makers and shorten their growth curve. So that Chris Argyris's work started the questions, and then just pulling from other literature and, really hashing it out with the thesis advisors and, my team. And I should mention them right now. Annie Wildermuth, Dr. Wildermuth, PhD, also a physician associate, also a dietitian and a leadership coach, has like a amazing background, tons of leadership experience. And then Dr. Josh Hartzell, which they should definitely listen to Josh's episode on your podcast and my podcast, retired Army colonel, prior program director, just steeped in the leadership literature, both inside and outside of medicine. And then Jerusalem, Dr. Merkabou, PhD, and her background is in emotions. So hopefully we'll have some time to talk about that and really, what we found out about emotions and change makers.
Okay. Before we get into some of the results, did you have what were your kind of research hypotheses going into the study before you had conducted the interviews and started to draw out the themes?
Yeah, it's interesting with, qualitative research. Is it inductive or deductive? We all go in with like our thoughts of like, who are the change makers that we've seen around us? We didn't hypothesize what the themes specifically were going to be. We went in with really open, we didn't even go in with the framework that we would end up necessarily with these individual and organizational. I mean, we did ask those types of questions, but the study was really quite open-ended, and we were just going to see what the data showed.
Great. And I mean, I think it's both fascinating, but also quite validating to read some of these themes. I don't necessarily find them very surprising. So I might let you tell me some of the core themes. I've written them all down here, and then we can go into a couple of them.
Yeah. I mean, in some ways, it's like, okay, what's the purpose of doing this research? We could, maybe, you're going to come to conclusion that, of course, all these things are really important if you read leadership books. And I totally understand that. But I think there's some subtleties and nuances. So insatiable learning, you got to be a lifelong learner. Inspiration and sustainment in change making, which facilitates courage and resilience. We can talk a little bit specifically about what we found in this population. Navigating the complex emotional landscape of leading change. Communicating for influence, listening for dissent and intentional messaging. And then at the organizational level, job crafting to enhance change making and owning change.
So, I mean, you could dive into any one of these topics. I mean, I think the lifelong learning, the kind of growth and learning mindset stands out for me. But I wanted to talk about sustaining inspiration, because I think this is the really challenging one. And when you talk about the nuance, you are able to dive into a bit more detail about how people actually maintained motivation. And I know I'll get you to expand, but part of this is that, as we've said at the beginning, the mission and purpose driven piece. But how do you sustain that, particularly as an individual, if you don't have the collective and if you don't have organizational support? So tell me a bit more about the nuance of what you found when you spoke with your study participants.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of us have been excited about a project when it first starts, and then that wanes. And so, one of the questions was about, how do you really keep that energy going? And what people described is they would go back in their life. They would think about, why did I pick up this project? One person described, I witnessed members of my family being discriminated against in the healthcare system. And that impacted they had premature deaths, certainly related to that. And so that keeps me going, even though this is really hard work and I'm in another meeting or I'm staying late. Other people talked about, like, I was a patient. I was somebody that had chronic pain and was treated poorly, by the medical system. So digging back into that narrative of your own life and the connections and, wanting to pay that forward and not only use it as activation energy, but use it as that sustainment energy.
Activation energy, I like that. And it goes back to what you said about the story of self. So I think of Pedja and Marshall Gann's work, People, Power, Change, the story of self,
Yes.
as now in that self, and really is driving the purpose and the mission. So a couple of other things that I saw, and we talked about at the beginning of this episode how our own first attempt at this fell apart, but the stabilizing relationships, and I think about peer support, and I think about you when I think of one of my stabilizing relationships professionally, but also being able to zoom in and zoom out. So have to step back for self-preservation energy and kind of to recharge and redirect.
Yeah. So, I mean, there were specific behaviors that people described, like I block my schedule. So literally, no one can put any meetings in there, no clinical shifts, and it's my mental health day. I write this email and it stays in the draft folder. Definitely this management of self, which you and I have talked about so many times. But again, like really being granular on those things. And they're all different for any individual person. But, I think we need to get to a place where people graduate medical school, certainly refine in residency how they manage themselves. Because you can, we've talked about it. You can't lead a team. You can't manage others if you're not managing yourself.
And I think the other thing that I've kind of written down here that relates to that, and something you and I have visited many, many times through our podcast, this idea of job crafting and having to very consciously create your professional landscape to fit and make room for the other areas, the mission and the passion projects, the change. But I think importantly, you said, a lot of your participants had highlighted the importance of compensated time for change making and, facilitating their job crafting, because I still think that's the piece that, inevitably we're not kind of really getting.
Yeah, and I think back to I just listened to the episode you recorded with, and I'm sorry, I'm like hypoglycemic right now, but it was the dual episode where you had two guests with Catherine Kroc, and I'm blanking on his very famous person. And, that all these people are running around your organization with these unique gifts. And, it's from the fulfillment literature in healthcare. They don't need a ton of a buy down. I mean, I get it. Not everyone can be a dean and have, 80% buy down. But what could happen in your organization with, really small seed grants? I mean, that was something that came up with during one of the interviews, is somebody describing, I was a junior faculty member and getting this seed grant. It was like $20,000. It made all the difference in his career. And he really pointed quite a bit to that one little grant in the grant scheme of things gave him so much, what he felt from the organization and then what he was able to do externally. He used that to provide branded materials from his university to other people in a professional society. And that meant a lot to him. So I just think about that, like, all the money that's spent in healthcare, and it may not take that much to unlock the gifts of the people working in your organization.
So building on that, I mean, there's somebody who's felt that their organization has invested in them and then has exponentially delivered. You identified that organizational support was mission critical to actually be effective. And again, this is the part that doesn't really surprise me, but tell me a bit more about the mechanics of this.
Yeah. So, people describe their organizations as large, bureaucratic, challenging, political things they needed to navigate, but nobody in this study described it as toxic. And I think that's really important for people to reflect on. But I do want people to leave today with a few things. And so this really, felt like, I don't know, comings together of a symphony for me and so many things that you and I have talked about. So if your organization values insatiable learning, then you have to put some money into funding things that support insatiable learning. So whether that's protected time for getting a certificate or, a seminar series, but you have to actually fund it. When you look at inspiration and sustainment in change making, that's where coaching and peer support, and that's where just culture, why is anybody going to want to try to do anything in your organization and try to improve it if they don't think at the end of the day it's a place where good things happen? Sponsorship relies on that. Sustainment and starting change also, you got to have appropriate workloads. If everyone's running on fumes, I can attest that many times when I've ran on fumes in my life, my creativity and problem solving goes completely down. So if you've got big complex problems, people need to not be in a fight or flight situation. Navigating the complex emotional landscape, that's about developing a greater emotional capacity. So, having programs that support metacognitive reflection, narrative medicine, Schwartz rounds. These are all things that we've talked about, but what I love about this is it's finally pulling it together. Like, this is why these programs matter, because these programs create more full humans with greater emotional capacity that are going to be able to listen. One of the themes was listening for dissent. It takes a ton of emotional intelligence to listen for dissent, to be secure enough in your self-worth that I can hear that, Cheryl really doesn't think, this process improvement project's going to work. And for me to really sit next to you and try to understand your perspective, and maybe you have some historical context to really do that. So these other types of programs provide that. And there's one other thing I want to say about communicating for influence. And doctors need more PR training. We need to start doing PR training in medical school. And, some of us got some in undergrad that you take a communications class and you have to pitch something. We need more help understanding how to pitch things, because we think the way I was taught to not pitch something, but the closest thing is, let me pull a bunch of research papers and overwhelm somebody with evidence. Well, the people in the C-suite, most of them, have a business background, and that's not how they're used to hearing information. Like, some evidence, sure, but they're expecting, you're used to pitching things with your MBA, but that's what they're expecting. And so if we have this huge business influence in medicine right now, then we have to understand how to break through all the noise. And that's, something that we haven't been taught. So I'll leave it there, pick up on any thread. I didn't go through leveraging the system.
Can we go there next?
Sure.
Can I just pick up on a couple of things?
Yeah.
Listening for dissent, I'd written down, because Josh and I actually had a great conversation about this in the latest podcast. I like the term aggressive listening.
Yeah.
And I think he quoted quite recently, is it General Colin Powell, when your soldiers stop bringing you their problems, you have stopped leading them. And we kind of, again, looking at some of the Gallup data, when your most enthusiastic employees have gone silent, that you really have a problem. And so did anything come out in terms of being that conduit and connector and looking to get the wider view about how people actually gathered information across an organization?
I think to gather information means that you have to have relationships and you have to have trust. And so that's the precursor. As far as scaling that, on an organizational level, if I could have a magic wand tomorrow, and one of the things I would want to happen in the hospitals I work in is 360 evals, for people and also for programs. I think there's so much stuff that gets implemented and started, and we never get the feedback piece of it. And it's difficult. It's difficult. I just trialed a new program in our sim lab, and the nurses loved it and the residents hated it. And it was really challenging for me to, hear how much the residents didn't like it. But now I know, and I'm really glad that we piloted it and that we're not going to roll it out for the residents.
So on that, did anything come out in the participants that you interviewed in how they took on the dissenting voices, but also how they continually acted as the bridge between their colleagues?
Yeah, I think I have a lot of tenacity, but tenacity really stood out with the participants, and that they really viewed no as a starting place. But I would say that, there's a way of viewing no as a starting place and choosing to be manipulative or conniving. And I wouldn't say that was anybody in this study. You can maybe fully push things through without creating true consensus or coalitions, but I doubt the change will sustain. So one of the things that people highlighted is when you're listening for dissent, A, it's uncomfortable and you have to have done the personal work to be able to withstand that. B, it slows things down. It just simply, your rollout is slower when you're taking feedback. But in the end, you will create a better product and you have a real shot at sustainment. And so that's why, you have to move slower. And I can think back to a couple of times in my career where I've kind of muscled things through and I've just been like, well, I have the title, I have the whatever, and this is what we're going to do. And inevitably, it's cost me in the relationship group. And then two, those changes just haven't been as durable.
Before we go on to some quick hits, based on, having been very familiar with this work now and literally steeped in it, what have you taken out of it that you will do differently going forward?
Yeah, I think the two things that really stood out to me was the two sides of the coin was the listening for dissent and the strategic messaging. And that comes back to that PR element of we're in such a fast-paced world right now, and there's so many things coming at people, to be really thoughtful of when you're going to enter someone's inbox, really thoughtful when you're going to enter a proposal, because everyone's really inundated, and to really try to have your messaging down, especially if, if you don't get a lot of shots with a person.
So the other thing that I wanted to ask, I might just spell your thinking, is on building the coalition that we mentioned from Cotter's work, because it is the kind of us piece of this, and that you can't do this work alone. Did anything come out about how people found their critical allies and partners in crime to lead change efforts?
Yeah, I think they networked. And that's something that came out of this is you can't do it alone. Nothing in healthcare right now. And so sometimes the networking is in your institution. Joining a committee is a form of networking on some level. But depending on what change you're making, your networking may need to extend way outside your own hospital. If you're trying to change a law, then, you're going to need a coalition across your state. So thinking very strategically about, where do I have connections? Where am I weak? If you want to change the way your hospital, manages codes, you got to get everybody that's involved in that involved. And so I think that's definitely a place. And then building that coalition, from a human standpoint, we all think we're the smartest people and that obviously what we're doing is right. So your tendency is going to be to gravitate towards people that, say yes and agree. again, it takes so much more emotional labor and time and personal strength to really try to get at those dissenting views and to not be fragile around that, and to have more curiosity and to be really focused, not so much on we're going to end up with the exact thing I think the way I want it to be, but I want to preserve the relationships. Because the truth is, change is so complex. You may be completely right, but with the way healthcare is right now, an external event may thwart what you need to have happen. And so if you damaged the relationships, then it was for naught anyway. So at the end of the day, what you really have, whether that change goes forward or not, is the relationships. And were you building them for the next fight that's going to come? Do people feel that you had integrity throughout the process, even if you end up in different places?
Fantastic. The listening for dissent piece, I keep going back to, because I think, so Josh and I had an in-depth conversation about this, and I had been talking to my dad last week, and he was talking about a colleague who chaired a board, and he would go around saying, at the end of whatever topic they were discussing, and said, so we all agreed. And everybody'd be like, yes. And he'd be like, well, okay, so let's stop. Let's take a beat. Let's take a step back and think again. What are we missing? What is the dissenting voice? And I think the other example that I always think of came from Collective Genius, Linda Hill's book. And I don't know if you've read that, and I can't remember, she talks a lot about Pixar in that book, so I can't remember if this was a Pixar specific or it was another organization, but essentially a new CEO in place. All the heads of department had come in for their weekly meeting to share, whatever their division or department, how they were going. And they had a traffic light system. And so green is basically, we're good. We have no problems. And, I think the previous leadership had set the culture and environment where you do not have any problems. And so everything was green. And he said, I'm just seeing green everywhere. You mean, that this cannot be right. And, I think, the kind of previous culture had set the tone that we might not be here next week if we bring, an amber or red slide to this meeting. And it took a couple of weeks for someone brave enough to have their amber slide. And then it was like, great, our colleague has an issue. Let's all dig in. Like, how can we support? How can we explore this further? And then slowly, you're getting a cultural shift.
Yep. The psychological safety. And we reference Amy Edmondson's work. No change that you really want occurs without psychological safety.
Going back to the individual, I know I said we go on to quick hits, but I've got one more thing. And I think the courage and resilience piece comes up again. And, I think I was thinking about what it means to have courage as a clinician in this space, because, at times it can definitely evade you. In terms of maintaining that courage, did any of your change makers, articulate that in a bit more detail? Clearly, the story of self was driving a little bit of that, but how they maintained it, particularly if they had a bit of a wobbly or, a negative experience or a setback.
Yeah. I mean, there were definitely people that talked about, essentially standing for something, and it was not the politically expedient route, and they took some hits for it. And really in those moments, they just focused on, why am I here? Why am I doing this? Going back to those personal narrative pieces. And then also just, I have to look myself in the mirror. I have to go to bed tonight. And, regardless of what ends up happening, I'm not going to sacrifice my integrity on this. And I think that's really missing right now in some pockets of our healthcare system. You and I have talked some about corporate influence in medicine. And, if your contract management group is asking you to do things that are definitely bad for patients and bad for your colleagues, you need to stand up You need to stand up for your people and for your patients and for your community. And, I think that that is what separates our industry from a lot of other industries. It's not like, a piece of clothing or something that's easily replaced when something goes wrong in healthcare. So I think really trying to develop that courage and integrity piece is really, really key.
Where does the work go next?
Yeah, so it'll be in a journal soon. We'll definitely keep you updated where that is. And then I have to do a little bit of soul searching about where this research goes. Do I continue it in kind of my capacity in the places that I work? Does it continue on in a PhD? I think the journey's still evolving. The study population was overrepresented with emergency physicians, and in some ways I'm very happy it was, because we have the highest burnout. So the people that we're able to change make in our emergency physicians are particularly interesting to me. So we may do a sub-analysis of emergency medicine physicians, and I think that would be really helpful in an EM journal. And I think invited commentary to frame those findings. Because at the end of the day, what I really want this work to do is inspire more change makers. You and I have spoke about this, at length, but it breaks my heart that we have colleagues that have given so much to become a doctor and that they hate their jobs, that they've committed suicide, that they're selling houses. It's fine if you really want to sell houses, but I would much rather keep you in medicine. And I think changemaking's a really big part of that pathway.
Fantastic. Now, you have some time for quick hits because I love
quick hits.
Questions.
Let's do it.
What have you changed your mind about?
Generally now. Yeah, I've changed my mind about emergency medicine being completely effed. I think we're in a tough spot, but I also think we're going to come out of this. I mean, we have to come out of this. Like, there's no other choice but to come out of this. I think we come out of it faster under certain conditions, but I am more optimistic.
And that's the zooming out of the change maker in you that I see, because you do need to, for self-preservation, have to step back, recoup. And, I see you continually stepping up then. So growth, getting rid of stupid stuff in healthcare, a lot of energy and appetite for this at the moment. What would you get rid of tomorrow?
Yeah, I mean, essentially, I think there should be an edict, again, with my magic wand, that you don't get to add a new step in a process without removing 2 steps in another process. Just constantly, okay, we're going to add this form, we're going to add this thing. Really? Like, we got to start removing some things at some point, else there really is not going to be any time at the bedside. So I would really challenge listeners out there. And I know, like, this is the thing, your heart's in a good spot. You want to be a change maker. And so you're, okay, we need this new thing to keep patients safe. How can you take something out somewhere else? Because we just can't keep adding.
Yeah. And take 2 things. I like it. What is the leadership lesson that you have to keep learning?
I think it's constantly feeling overextended and, not being able, you have to leave enough slack in your schedule for the unexpected to come up. The unexpected that your boss is going to say, I need a solution for this quickly. And the unexpected joy, like, I really want to be a guest on that podcast, or I really want to, give a talk at this place. So I'm trying to figure out how to leave about 20% slack in my schedule, knowing that inevitably it will still fill up.
Finally, on the self-fuzz now, my theme of the moment, what is your call to action?
My call to action is simple. Be a change maker. Yeah. And you don't have to form a new organization. You don't have to write a book. I'm talking as simple as just standing up for your colleagues and your patients on small things. If there's a patient safety thing, file the patient safety report, send the email, speak up at your staff meeting. Just little tiny things, just don't check out. And if you're finding that you continually need to check out, and I would really ask you to take a look, what needs to happen personally for you to be able to check back in.
Yeah, I encourage you to dive into any of Andrea or even my own podcast episodes over the many years, where there's lots of episodes to support that personal work too. I think before we finish, because we didn't really get an opportunity to talk about this, you did birth a book into the world at the end of last year, which is incredible. And we spoke a bit about it on the end of last year's podcast before the release. And so Revitalize has now been out in the world for about 6 months. And if you haven't read it, get your copy. And so what response have you had?
Yeah, I mean, it's not flying off the shelves by any stretch. It's what I think our friend Josh describes as a Toyota Corolla launch. It hopefully will last hopefully will last a long time. I think the best part is when I get an email or a text message or a screenshot from somebody. And, I think that those are very personal things, right? That somebody shares with me that, hey, this passage really resonated with me, or the way you described that, I didn't know there was a word for that. So that's what I'm most happy for, is those very individual moments that readers open up and share what was valuable to them, and that the book is resonating with them.
I hope there'll be a book on changemakers coming soon. But on that topic of other books and lifelong learning, because you and I are always looking for the next book, the next paper, the next podcast, is there anything you've read or listened to lately on this or related topics that you'd recommend?
Yeah, I read Malcolm Gladwell's Revenge of the Tipping Point. I just love Malcolm. It's a really fast read. And I have to admit, there were a lot of moments I was kind of scratching my head trying to really understand the points that he was making. But the biggest thing I took away from it is everything is a tipping point. And for us right now, and how to link this back to change making, it can feel so frustrating that we're talking about taking care of healthcare professionals, that it's fundamental to taking care of patients. And we feel like we've been saying this for years, because we have. But we just haven't hit the tipping point yet. But that doesn't mean it's not coming. And you look at all the great work that the Lorna Breen Foundation's doing. And I'm so sorry that it took losing Lorna for that organization to birth into the world, but it's doing amazing things. So for the change makers out there, sometimes it's slow and steady, but sometimes it is slow and then it's fast all at once. So don't lose faith that it just hasn't gotten to be a tipping point yet, that people need to have healthcare in the United States, that we need to figure out a way to bring down costs in a way that's equitable and fair. It just hasn't gotten to that point yet, but it doesn't mean it won't.
I think that's the message I needed to hear. I need a bit of strategic hope. I'm going to keep pushing on walls, and one of these days I'm going to find the weak spot and the tipping point, and we're going to have a breakthrough. I think the other thing is I've just recently joined Pedja and his team and Samuel at the Heart Programme for Courageous Clinicians. So I'll give a bit more information about that on my podcast, and we can maybe link it in the show notes. And so that finding your the coalition and finding your critical friends in this work is very important. One final question. We talk a lot about personal prescriptions for professional and personal well-being, because that can change day to day, moment to moment, and at different times in our life and careers. Where are you at the moment, and what are you working on to really look after yourself and to keep you stepping up at work?
Yeah, I think what I lost during the book was my physical fitness. I spent a lot of time sitting and writing. So I'm working my way back to that. I'm really proud that I've gone to 2 yoga classes each Sunday. It's becoming part of my Sunday ritual when I'm not working.
Lovely.
And I'm really, really excited about that. And I've felt really, really good at those classes. And then, okay, there's one other thing, and I'm not wearing the type of shirt that I can show you, but I think you saw on social media, I got a tattoo.
And I
got
feel like
the
we need a
tattoo.
good visual of that.
Yeah, we'll definitely, maybe we'll figure out a way. But yes, I got a tattoo of the heart that's on my book. And it's been fascinating watching how people respond to it because I've never had a tattoo. And, I was after my yoga class, I was in the grocery store and this woman came up to me and she goes, "Is that real?" And I was just kind of, I think I was also hypoglycemic. And I was kind of like, "What are you talking about?" And then she's like, "That." And then we had this like really nice exchange about, what it was and then the artist who did it. And so it's been kind of this like unexpected form of connection with people that I'm still trying to wrap my head around. So yeah, yoga and tattoos. Maybe call that the name of the episode.
Yeah, and I think just on birthing the book, I have a good friend who has some tattoos that really remind her of her children. And so you have this, that this book is part of you, and it's such a beautiful artwork as well.
Thank you. Yes. Well, this has been really, really fun. And I want to come on your pod and interview you sometime because I think it's nice. I've received feedback that listeners want to hear every once in a while from me in the guest chair. So I think we need to get Cheryl in.
Andrea, keep up the great work. It's you
the
that
guest
keeps
chair.
me showing up.
Yay. All right. Well, thank you for being guest host. Thanks for listening to Heartline, conversations with healthcare changemakers following their heartlines. I'd so appreciate it if you could take a quick moment and hit the like button and also the subscribe button that you'll find within your podcast app or platform that you're listening on. It also really helps if you can leave a review. I would certainly appreciate a 5-star review and a few comments about what you liked about this podcast. Don't forget, you can also forward this to people in your network. People love getting new podcasts and changing up what they're listening to. So sending a podcast to a friend or colleague, or even to start a conversation about a change that needs to happen in your organization is a great way to be a change maker. This podcast represents the views of the host and guests. It does not represent the views of any entity we work for or with. It is also for informational use only and does not replace any professional advice, including medical or psychological. If you are interested in unlocking your true potential, reach out to me. If you're an organization interested in supporting the well-being of your people, I'd love to connect on innovative solutions. Schedule a strategy session at andreaaustinmd.com. Sound editing services are provided by Better Podcasting Services, and you can find their website at betterpodcastingservices.com. And I'd also like to thank our future Dr. Caitlin Din, who is the production assistant for this podcast.
You have been listening to Dr. Andrea Austin on the Heartline Changemaking in Healthcare podcast, brought to you today by the Mindful Medic podcast. I hope you enjoyed today's conversation as much as we did recording it. I will put a link in the show notes to Andrea's podcast and you can learn more about her work. We will be back to business as usual on the podcast for the next episode, and I have an incredible guest lined up, and we are going to dive into the applied research and evidence base in physician and healthcare wellbeing. I can think of no better guest to have this conversation with. I know that we're all going to get a lot out of it. So I look forward to joining you then, and take care.